Windsor, Ontario is the capital of lightning strikes in Canada. And like the old saying goes, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, in meteorology, where there's a severe thunderstorm, there's the possibility of tornadoes. Hi, I'm Chris May, host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast from the Weather Network in Canada. On April 3rd of 1974, an F3 tornado crossed the Detroit River and tore through Windsor, Ontario. But it was just one of 148 tornadoes to touch down in North America on this day in weather history. The 1974 Windsor tornado still stands as the sixth deadliest tornado in Canadian history. On this day, it sadly killed 9 people while injuring dozens more. It is also come to be remembered for the extensive toll it took on not just life but infrastructure, especially to the Windsor Curling Club on Central Avenue. It started at the Devonshire Mall, where renovations were underway on a new expansion. The storm twisted steel frames and flipped over a crane at the south end of the mall. Then it was on its way next to the Curling Club. The tornado was on the ground long enough to leave a damaged track 22 kilometers long and was reported to have been as wide as 300 meters. When it struck the Central Avenue Curling Club, it could not have coincided with a worse time possible. The twister hit the club at 8:09 p.m. that night. Environment Canada's warning went out at 8:15 that night. But around 8 p.m., the place was filled to the rafters with participants and spectators alike all gearing up for the finals of the Chrysler Blue Broom Bonspiel, one of the season's last tournaments, and everyone was there. Remember that this day in weather history can be enjoyed a number of ways. Right now, you are listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there is also the daily podcast video short. They are shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, and oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. So, by 8:09, the tournament was a few ends into the first game of the night. Quote, "If I remember correctly, we had 6 sheets of ice and we were full." That came from Bill Snellgrove, who was there that night. There was then a deafening clap of thunder, and that's when the tornado promptly ripped the roof off the building, and another connected concrete wall fully collapsed. And when that wall collapsed, it killed Mr. Keith Allen, a 42-year-old accountant, who was one of 8 people killed that night, with that 9th I told you about, who died later in hospital. Keith was Bill's best friend and husband to Louise Gulak, who vividly remembers that night. She remembers when a doctor came into her hospital room with the worst imaginable news anyone could ever hear. Her husband, Keith Allen, was in fact already dead at the scene. Rescue efforts were fast, but in treacherous conditions and in total darkness. Along with Keith Allen, we also lost that night Chris Haddad, Charles Pleasance, Donald Little, James Burt, Yvonne Beaton, Derek Barlow, Alec Bryan, and Leo Belanger. The deadly Windsor tornado was actually the tail end of a super outbreak of storms that also wreaked havoc across a massive area of the United States. In all, 148 twisters touched down in 13 U.S. states, plus the province of Ontario, over a very short 24-hour period, making this 1974 super outbreak one of the largest and most violent tornado events ever recorded anywhere. It was responsible for the lives of 330 people, while injuring nearly 5,500 others, traveling a combined total of 4,200 kilometers across the states of Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, and Alabama. And in Xenia, Ohio, that was where an F5 tornado went nuts. And that's tomorrow in part 2 of this story about the 1974 super outbreak on this day in weather history with me, your host, Chris May. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history.